I can't tell you at the end of each summer the amount of painting over I've had to do, the amount of massaging hurt feelings, the amount of apologizing I've had to do on behalf of groups who are never coming back, people who came to the city for a week and will never see it again. If that's what we're going to keep doing, keep it. It's not worth it. At least in my city. There's 4,000 churches here. I'd rather put my time and energy into helping those churches be better disciple makers, better missiologists in their own neighborhoods, than let you come here and ruin my home.
Welcome to Reimagining Short-Term Missions, the podcast that takes an honest yet hopeful look at the things that Christians do in the name of missions. We feature frank conversations with people from all over the world, and we don't shy away from tackling the hard and uncomfortable questions. Questions like, what happens when people who participate in short-term missions do it for the wrong reasons? How much damage can be done by short-term teams when they haven't taken an honest inventory of their own fears and prejudices, when they haven't done the necessary hard work in advance? In this episode, we'll look for answers to these questions and more as we talk to CJ Quartlbaum, a writer and speaker from Brooklyn, New York. His current work focuses on theology, culture, and personal development, and in particular, he advocates for more accurate and honest teaching of Black history than what is currently taught in schools. CJ is also one of the authors featured in the book Reimagining Short-Term Missions, and his essay, called When Non-Believers Go on Mission Trips, draws on his experiences hosting short-term teams, mostly from white suburbs, who traveled to New York ostensibly to serve in the name of missions. More often than not, though, he has seen some of these visitors cause hurt and disruption when they act not out of genuine Christ-like love and humility, but more out of self-interest, unexamined bias, and even deep-seated racism. Friends, we can figure out better ways to love and serve the world, and it starts with courageous conversations. That's what we're about, so welcome to Reimagining Short-Term Missions. Welcome, CJ. Thanks for taking time to tell us about your work and share some wisdom from experience.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here with you.
Perhaps you could tell us a bit about yourself and what you're invested in day to day. And I'm especially interested in the work that you've done over the years with short-term mission teams.
I'm invested in a lot day to day. I'm a writer and speaker from Brooklyn, New York. I founded a nonprofit named Labor Forward, where the goal is to fill the narrative gap that is caused by the erasure of Black history. I spent some time as the director of a short-term missions organization in New York. We hosted mission trips in the city. And that was honestly my first exposure to the missions world. Growing up poor in the city, poor and Black in the city, that's not something we did. I look back and there was maybe like one or two missionaries, and those were always people who went somewhere far. But my church never took a mission trip. I had never been on the mission trip. I would say I fell backwards into this, but we know that the way God works, you don't just fall backwards into things. He is sovereign over all things. But I went from working in finance to leading mission trips. So
you wrote a chapter in the book called When Non-Believers Go on Mission Trips, which is a pretty provocative title. I'm wondering what you mean when you say non-believer.
I was very specifically referring to non-Christians. We know what American Christianity is like. It is a box that you check. You check the Barna Study and the American Bible Society. They do, both of these organizations do their studies every year, and every year we find the same thing. A lot of Americans claim to be Christians, but a lot of what should be basics for all of us are just non-existent. Christianity in this country is very much not even just a box that you check, but it's the accessory to your life. It's like, I'm going to do all the things I want to do and be who I want to be, and I'm going to add some Jesus into that, or he's the cherry on top. And that looks very different across demographics across the country, and yet it is still almost a unifying factor of American Christianity.
It's almost like Christianity is a culture more than it is a heartfelt worldview.
Right.
This matter of heart, I think, is a key theme in what you've written about. And you at some point say, I'll read it actually, when it comes to seeing the truth about a person's heart, the same can be said of mission trips. That is, you start by saying sports doesn't build character, it reveals it. And then you say that mission trips do the same thing. In what sense do mission trips reveal a person's heart?
I have this wonderful analogy that I like to use. So I have a huge family, right? Huge. 33 first cousins on both sides. And a lot of those cousins, I kind of sit near the top on both, age-wise. A lot of my cousins younger than me are girls. And a lot of these girls are starting to date. I'm not happy about it, but I understand it's the natural progression of life. And they come to me and they say, CJ, what should I be looking for in a man? And I say, let me play basketball with him. And they're like, why? And I feel like everything you want to learn about a guy, you can learn on the basketball court. You learn how he handles adversity. You learn if he's a sore winner, if he's a sore loser. Is he a good team player? Is he angry? You learn all of these different things. And I find that on mission trips, you find out a lot of the same. Because mission trips, by nature, they should be a bit hard. They should be a bit difficult. And you start to watch people, and it's like, how are you handling that difficulty? For us, we housed our groups in what was the oldest church in Brooklyn. And when I tell you that building was old, it was old. And this is in the middle of summer with no AC in this building, just fans, and sleeping in sleeping bags or air mattresses. And it's an old building in New York. So there were friends who roamed the building at night of the rodent variety. Mm-hmm. And again, it's New York, and in all of our other cities, they would drive from place to place. But it's New York, so we take the subway. How do they handle taking the subway? How do they handle walking long distances? One of the things that we did was we had them eat food from different cultures every night. How are they handling quote unquote strange food? It revealed a lot of the character, and most importantly was how did they interact with the people they served. Oftentimes we would look at someone, and obviously it's a mission trip, so we're usually serving people who are lower class in terms of their economic standing. And so often, and I find this is very true in kind of suburban white Christianity America, your economic status and your level of virtue are somehow seen as equal. That the more virtuous you are, of course you'll have more money. And if you are poor and destitute, it's because you lack virtue. It's because you are a less holy person. It's because you don't have God in your life. And it would, every year, every week, it was this constant reminder to people that money does not mean Jesus loves you more. And I would have so many groups be shocked when they're standing on that soup kitchen line and they're handing out, whatever the meal is, and people who are receiving the food are quoting more scripture to them than they know. And their mind is blown. They're like, oh, you know the Bible? You know Jesus? I thought I was here to save you. And it revealed a true poverty mindset that lived in those who are economically wealthy.
Do you think that, as some of these visitors confronted that reality, do you think they actually saw that in them? Were there groups that actually said, my bias is keeping me from seeing clearly, or I have grown up in a way that demonized the city, made us afraid of the city? Do you think there were people who actually embraced that truth and then did something with it? Or more often were they avoiding the truth and finding a way just to get around it and go home?
While I wasn't with the groups every day, I was with them a couple of nights during the week. And it hurt me so much to see people come in, use my city, abuse its people, and then go back to their lush lives. So I very intentionally created debrief questions for every night that got to the heart of that. And then we would do the second to last night, we would have a worship night where all the groups that were in, we got together, we sang some songs, we had a speaker, and then I would get up at the end of the night and I would ask questions. And I would ask very pointed questions about who you are, about what you've seen this week, about the way it's affected you. What are you taking back home with you? I would always say it's cute that you were here for a week, but whether you came or not, the city was going to go on. There are needs where you are as well. The suburbs are just as dark and violent of a place. It just looks different.
I would imagine that there might have been more openness on the part of some of these teams if they had actually prepared to listen to truth, prepared to see that part of themselves. And you know, if that's the case, what sort of preparation actually does make sense? How ought these groups to have prepared for their experience? What kinds of questions should they have been asking themselves before they even came?
The first things first is know and understand your bias. Know and understand your identity. And this is beyond racially. It's where are you from? You know, you can be a black person from New York is not the same as a black person from Seattle. There might be some shared experiences, some shared understandings, but my experiences vocationally or just from an education perspective, I have a master's degree. That means I'm viewing the world in a certain way. I'm thinking and processing in a certain way. I need to be mindful of that. I have PhD ambitions, so that says something about me. So people have to, they have to ask those questions about who they are and where they're from and what that means for their lives and the way they see the world, the way they orient themselves in the world, the way they walk and talk and speak and think and act. And from there, where are you going? What do you know about that place?
I would imagine that, to have this stance that you're talking about, to be a learner, to be open to seeing things about our hearts that need to be addressed, need to be changed, that really starts with humility. And if people are not willing to enter into this experience with humility, there's almost no chance they're going to be getting any of this, right? Facing any of these truths, making any of these realizations, facing any of their biases. Have you found that there have been some folks who are just sort of intractable and don't come with that stance of teachability?
Oh, yeah. People who come in and they make statements and ask questions in a way that is more combative than anything else. So I led these trips, this organization from 2015 until 2019. That is pretty much the height and rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm a black man. I'm in New York. New York by itself has a laundry list of names that we can go through of people who have been unjustly murdered at the hands of the police. And knowing that, we would do prayer tours where we would lead people around the city and we would highlight different issues and we would pray about them. Given the time and era that we were in, of course we were going to talk about police brutality. Of course we were going to talk about economic inequality. Of course we were going to talk about health disparities and all these different things. And I had one guy say to one of my hosts, well, isn't the problem that black people are just insubordinate? If they would just listen, they wouldn't have any problems. I was giving a talk for a group on a mission trip last year. So I'm not with the organization anymore, but I was doing it for another one. And the talk was about Christian unity. That's it, just Christian unity. It wasn't a race talk, but he assumed because I was black, that one of their leaders, that I was talking about critical race theory. And immediately just wanted to shut down the conversation, didn't want to hear anything I had to say. And I'm like, how are you going on a mission trip to a group of people you're largely going to be serving black and brown people because we're doing this in the inner city, and yet you're not even willing to hear what they're going through? Some of the, I hate to characterize people in this way, but some of the worst people that I've had interactions with are the ones who, when you look at their social media profiles, it's them posing on a mission trip with some black or brown kid, almost as this virtue signal of, look at how good I am. But I'm not willing to give credence to anything they go through. I don't believe their struggles are real, but let me come save them with this gospel of truth that I love and believe.
You're talking about the culture of the city. You're talking about people coming from the outside encountering that sort of difference and oftentimes looking down on that difference, assuming that the folks are less than because, after all, they're there to serve them, right? They have something to give them. But really, this is a global dynamic. If you think about short-term missions anywhere, I mean, a lot of the same stuff is going on. If you have relegated people to the mission field, in a lot of ways, you've disallowed them from saying anything important, from speaking truth that might change you, from having influence on your faith walk. And, I think what you're pointing out is this dynamic that really causes dehumanization of the people that, supposedly were there to serve. And you actually use that word in your chapter. You talk about how bias leads to dehumanization. What does that look like in New York?
We have this reputation for being this godless city. People they're looked at almost as projects. You're just a soul I'm here to save. I just want you to pray the prayer. It's just really crummy. Because you're not seeing people as people, you're seeing them as objects. It is an objectification of someone's plight and circumstances, I guess, to make you feel better, because we experienced a lot of poverty tourism. I've had so many kids come on these trips and tell me, my parents sent me so that I would appreciate my things more. Like, what does that say about the person you were there to serve, about their situation? That it's just here to make you feel better because you have a PlayStation and an Xbox and they sleep on a bench at night. Like that, how are we trying to equate these two things? How are we viewing that as okay?
Well, you're pointing out this sort of objectification dynamic that also happens in short-term missions. That, I know a lot of youth group leaders, for example, who will want their students to encounter cultures or encounter poverty, let's say, in order to be changed, in order to have their perspective changed, maybe be transformed, and maybe be more appreciative of what they have, maybe get a better sense of what it means to live in a globalized world. Who knows? But I wonder if there isn't something, as good as those motives might be, if there's not something that actually makes the people in the context they visit into objects, because what they're there for is to teach us and change us and make us, come away with something good. It's not this sort of co-equal engagement. It's not relationship.
I think if you're going to engage in short-term missions, you need to engage in relationships. And it's never going to be a relationship if I'm always above and you're below. If my sole objective is to it's serve you, but really serving myself, I don't have anything to learn from you, I'm bringing you everything, then it's never going to be seen as equal. But if we take a longer term view of short-term missions, then we build relationships and we get to know people, and we're sending people both ways. Because like I said, the suburbs are just as dark and violent of a place. It just looks differently. The amount of teenage drug and alcohol abuse is the same, but it's done within the cloak of people's homes. I've seen studies that say that drug abuse is actually more rampant in the suburbs because of that veneer of safety. So that tells me you're not just coming to save my kids, we need to go save yours as well. And I think what's hard for people to accept in that is if their kids need to be saved too, and they're adults, that means that we as the sending church, we're not doing something right. That's a hard pill for people to swallow.
I want you to read something for me, if you would. Homework and heart work. Maybe you could read that for us, and then I have some questions about that particular paragraph.
For these reasons, I would argue that if any church endeavors to send short-term missionaries for the sake of the gospel, they need to make sure that the ones who are sent actually believe in the gospel to the point where their hearts and minds have been transformed, or at least be aware of and open to the continual process of transformation that leads us ever closer to Christ-likeness. Only then will they be able to offer any sort of compelling witness to God's work in their lives. In preparation for urban missions, those who would be part of the team need to do the necessary hard work that seeks to identify and address the unhelpful beliefs and assumptions that, if left in the dark, will always keep people from being agents of God's grace in the city.
There are some really deeply important ideas in this paragraph. And just the very first one, I love that term, heart work. What is heart work? What does that involve?
I think about Paul saying to us to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. I think about Romans 7. I do the things I want to do. I don't do the things I want to do. Wretched man that I am, who can save me from this body of death? Thanks be to God for Christ Jesus. You know, there are a lot of things going on in our heads and in our hearts. It's something I've actually been writing about a lot lately, is that there's a war for our minds and for our hearts. There's a war for our attention. And I think just watching just kind of the narrative over the last few years, we as Christians, by and large, and I say we because I think it's all of us, we are not being discipled by the scriptures. We're not being discipled by our church community. We're not listening to the Holy Spirit. We're being discipled by culture. And culture is always going to disciple us in a way that leads us away from Jesus. And if that is the case, then we need to check our hearts. And before we go on mission trips, we need to take a real examination at who's discipling us, who/what. What is informing our hearts? Because as Jesus said, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. I think the only way you can make a statement like, well, black people just need to, behave better, that speaks to a callousness that looks at people of color in the city as objects, as deserving of whatever ill fates they receive, because you don't view them as made in the image of God. Because if you took Genesis 1 very seriously, in the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them, then you can't look at anyone in any condition and say, well, you deserve that. You look at them as a brother or a sister. And so I've only really come to this conclusion post writing this chapter, but I'm thinking a lot lately about who and what is discipling us. And that hard work is figuring that out so that we can be more effective in the mission field.
A lot of authors in the book, they talk about a dynamic of inequality and looking down, the sort of top-down worldview. They're critiquing it and offering ways around that, offering ways beyond that. But in essence, what many people, including you, are saying is that there are some elements of the church, for whatever reason, usually based in bias and sometimes in racism, that certain elements of the church just are assuming this stance of superiority, and therefore in going to ostensibly serve in different contexts, they actually do objectify, they dehumanize. But what the authors in this book, our book, are calling for is more mutuality. Basically the assumption that anything, if we're going to do anything in short-term mission in the future, it's got to be something negotiated by everybody, by all parts of the global church, people who host, people who send, right? Because only then are we actually going to be acknowledging those folks as our brothers and sisters, as co-equals. And I think that's a really high bar, actually. But I think there is no other way that you can do mission and call it Christ-centered.
We are called absolutely to make disciples of all nations. And so I understand the heart behind the mission trip. But we're also called to make disciples at home. And our land, our home, is fertile ground for mission as well. Because if it wasn't, this country would probably look a lot different. And I think it takes a certain level of humility to recognize that. A certain level of humility to say, we need you just as much as we think you need us. And we have so much to learn from you. Because the center of the church right now, the center, is the global south. And I don't remember the exact quote, but someone was like, the average Christian right now looks like I think he said it was like a South American woman in her mid-40s or something like that. Like, do you have that vision when you think about the church, about who represents the church, who's speaking into the church, who's shaping it? Because over the next 30 years, I mean, not even over the next 30 years, starting now, people are sending from around the world, people are sending mission trips here. They are sending teams here. And I think we're going to be the last ones to realize that.
I want you to read one more paragraph for me, if you would. And it's the last paragraph of your chapter.
It might seem to some that if renewed and renewable minds are prerequisite for urban short-term missions, that might be setting the bar too high. Might these higher standards result in fewer short-term mission teams doing urban missions? Frankly, I hope so. Sending unprepared teams can be a sad misuse of resources, and it usually does little, if any, good for urban communities. Still, as a believer in Christ, I am never without hope. If sending churches can help the people they send to transform their hearts and minds well in advance of a trip, then the practice of short-term missions might just be radically reformed enough that they produce deep and lasting good for everyone involved.
So I'm imagining that if there are people who get hold of this book and read it, that these would be hard words to hear, hard words to read. Are you really saying that you think there should be fewer short-term mission trips?
If they continue in the way that they've been going, absolutely. I can't tell you at the end of each summer the amount of painting over I've had to do, the amount of massaging hurt feelings, the amount of apologizing I've had to do on behalf of groups who are never coming back, people who came to the city for a week and will never see it again. If that's what we're going to keep doing, keep it. It's not worth it. At least in my city. There's 4,000 churches here. I'd rather put my time and energy into helping those churches be better disciple makers, better missiologists in their own neighborhoods, than let you come here and ruin my home.
For those who do get hold of the book, Reimagining Short-Term Missions, what is the main idea that you would like them to take away from reading your essay?
Know Jesus. Know him for real. Remember the great commandments. Love God, love others. And in theory, the rest will take care of itself.
You've been listening to the Reimagining Short-Term Missions podcast. If you want to explore more diverse and challenging perspectives like this, check out a new book called Reimagining Short-Term Missions, which includes chapters written by our podcast guests and from many more STM innovators from around the world. Your podcast host is Forrest Inslee, co-editor of that book and a professor of global studies at Northwest University in Seattle. Angel Burns is the book's co-editor, and our podcast producer is Heath Hollinsby. Friends, what we need now is nothing short of a revolution in short-term missions. So please help us spread the word by sharing this podcast with others of like heart and mind. This is the time for reimagining short-term missions.